Hi, I'm chrisP. I'm not a game reviewer, but I have been playing the Battlefield series since Battlefield Vietnam. I've also been playing competitively since Battlefield 4 in 2015, which honestly just means I kind of fall under even more obscure and less appealing subsection of tryhards. Anyways, I'm going to be reviewing Battlefield 5, which was released worldwide about 2 weeks ago. I'll be doing my best to kind of try and look at the game from the perspective of someone who's been following the series for a while, rather than kind of try to review it to whatever the industry standards are these days. I'll be timestamping the video in the description, which I expect to get pretty long, so you're more than welcome to skip around. Now, before I really begin to review the game, I think it'd be difficult not to touch on the reveal trailer debacle and the current public perception of the game, which was and is an absolute mess. My take is that EA was clearly trying to get Battlefield to finally match its biggest current competitors in the genre, PUBG, Fortnite, and of course Call of Duty. All three of these games offer a ton of player cosmetic options, and all offer playable female characters. Call of Duty has had female options for ages. PUBG and Fortnite pull in a ton of money by selling cosmetic options. Fortnite, in fact, monetizes itself purely through just that. Since the reveal trailer, we've kind of learned that EA, admirably, was trying to basically adopt the PUBG model and provide post-release content for free, while monetizing its cosmetic options instead of charging $50 for additional content like they used to. When you consider all of that, it's easy to see why EA thought it'd be a great idea, if not important, for the reveal trailer to feature the now infamous red-headed woman running around in the front lines of World War II with prosthetic arms that could give most modern amputee solutions a run for their money. EA clearly wanted to get across two messages. Hey, look, you can play as women now, and look at all these crazy cosmetic options you can get. This is a message that probably wasn't appropriate for a game set in World War II, and that was largely what many took issue with. EA could have been upfront and honest about why the trailer was what it was, why the game had all this, and taken a bit of an L, and then focus on selling and promoting the game itself, which is something DICE actually did try to do after the debacle and managed to earn some of the faith back from its fan base. Now, I can appreciate that EA, which already has an awful reputation after the Battlefront debacle, can be feeling a little bit uneasy about talking about new monetization models, but the way they try to circle around the conversation was just absolutely insane. EA opted to play the social justice card and basically lumped all negative criticisms as being ignorant and sexist, and told people to shove off if they didn't like it, when in fact the way EA responded was actually ignorant, disingenuous, and quite despicable when you consider that they were just using social justice to divert the conversation away from their new profit model, a profit model which really isn't all that bad in the first place. And at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal when you're playing multiplayer and just hear a woman screaming once in a while. And the way EA handled it then just did insane amount of damage to the game's public perception and reputation. It's still reeling from that. And as much as I'd love to move on from this stupid topic, EA's marketing made yet another terrible mistake. And whether this is more a decision on DICE's or EA's part is kind of hard to say, but EA's marketing at least should have been wiser and should have said something. I mean, look at all these grayed out boxes. Look at all of this content that's not going to be in the game at launch because it's supposed to be part of Tides of War, what they're calling their new post-release content support, which is free. Battlefield 5 went into launch with horribly confusing release schedule, a terrible public perception, and now it's gonna be, and it is, being pounded for being incomplete. Most likely by the same people that drooled all over Battlefield 1. A critical success and a game that was widely received well by the public and sold gangbusters. Except, with the competitive scene, but more on that later. Battlefield 1 had more or less the same number of content at launch as Battlefield 5. Same number of weapons, never got a practice range, less weapon customization options, and I mean on a practical level, not just the aesthetics. less number of vehicles, same number of modes, and like 9 maps in multiplayer over Battlefield 5's 8. And even though most of Battlefield 1's maps were built terribly, Battlefield 1 did have Battlefield 5 at least has much better quality maps. Battlefield 1 did have 6 single-player acts over Battlefield 5's 4, but if you actually compare the actual runtime it takes to play through them all, Battlefield 1's campaign wasn't that much longer at all. It was maybe like 10-15 minutes longer. And yet, Battlefield 5 is currently getting pounded for it being incomplete. Almost entirely because of the terrible public perception that the marketing team established since day one. And their marketing team absolutely gave up on or continued to fail the handle the messaging on their product. And just kept going back to the social justice well. And they are still doing that. We're only comparing the two games by quantity here, which is actually a terrible way to measure any game. But I'm having to address the game's incomplete sentiment and rattling off like a fanboy, which for the record I don't think I am. You know, like most dedicated or competitive players, I also moonlight as a DICE cynic, and I could criticize DICE on just about every level for days. However, when the public the messaging is screwed up this badly, it's an important point worth making. And all of this nonsense will ultimately affect me as a player when certain modes can't be played during reasonable hours anymore because the player base isn't what the game could and should be getting. And, you know, also when player pool isn't big enough to sustain a healthy skill pyramid for a functioning competitive scene. Well, that is if the game is allowed to have one, but I'll get to that in a bit. Now, I'll move on to talking about the actual game, and I'll carry on to a positive here. The infantry in Battlefield 5 has seen a couple big changes, and they've largely been for the better. DICE actually left the class roles remain largely the same from Battlefield 1, with Recon, of course, still being notably being the most useless class 90% of the time, or unless your name is Stode. The attrition system, which is what DICE is calling limiting ammo and health, hasn't really had the impact I think they desired on teamwork. People who don't revive still don't. People who don't give out health and ammo packs still don't. Attrition has led people going to the objectives a little bit more often to restock and generally be more cautious with their health. Ultimately and indirectly teaching them to try and make better decisions. But what really truly influences the infantry are the changes to the revive system. Firstly, the actual act of reviving now triggers an animation, and it commits you to be locked immediately and directly over the person that you're reviving. No longer can you just like run around poking downed players right back to life in a split second, and reviving players is now a commitment that leaves you as exposed to whatever killed the person that you're reviving. This means there are a lot less revives being spammed out for the sake of farming points. But most notably, the new revive animation kind of keeps the people from abusing the revive system by forming these massive revive trains and muscling through obstacles and holds that they really honestly shouldn't be able to otherwise. And yet, there is a bigger change to the revive system now. Now, any squad mate can also revive you, even without being a medic. The fact that squad mates can now revive has kind of led people to work more closely with their squads, sticking together more, motivated by the ultimate incentive of not having to go back to that deployment screen. And this, I think, was a fairly successful implementation that has been pretty effective in practice. The non-medic revive from a squad mate does take twice as long, clocking in at about 4 seconds, as opposed to a medic's 2 seconds, which still definitely gives medics usefulness. And they still have that extra capacity to be able to sneak in quick revives that I think other classes just couldn't, because 2 seconds is a long time in Battlefield 5. And also, in addition to the revive changes, to kind of further reward squads and to make them be more incentivized to work together, which they kind of already started to do and ultimately perform more effectively, squads will now start to collect collectively accrue points during a match that will allow the squad leader to start calling in like rewards, supply drops, special vehicles, and of course the V1 rocket, which is basically a mini nuke. That said, I almost never see anyone use the squad points for anything else but the V1 rockets, which when I first saw it, was kind of worried that it would be overpowered at first. But the V1 rockets are actually largely avoidable, and it kind of seems to at least discourage people from kind of like mindlessly clustering up and being stagnant in heavy mobs in certain points of the map, which also used to be a problem before. And of course, V1 rockets are quite satisfying to drop and or just watch. And there, of course, are the heavily revamped weapon mechanics. The gunplay in Battlefield 5 isn't quite perfect, with the medic weapons feeling somewhat underwhelming. The certain weapons, especially like the KE7, the starter weapon for the support class, feeling a little bit too strong. And of course, the TTD issues, which is time to die, feeling a little bit too short, even though TTK, time to kill, was actually increased since the alpha and the beta. Despite these issues, most of which I think will be addressed relatively soon and will continue to be addressed well enough by DICE, just because they're relatively simple changes, maybe except TTD, which could be netcode related. Despite all of these issues, I still do think the gunplay in Battlefield 5, even as it is most definitely the best thing about it. And in fact, the gunplay is probably the best it's ever been in the series. Battlefield 1 most infamously utilized healthy dosages of spread, random bullet deviation to balance almost all of their weapons except sniper rifles. Spread being used to determine engagement distances, effective ranges to oppressive levels, I might add, left very little to distinguish one player from another beyond who shot first. And things like being more precise, managing recoil, and tracking your target while you managed recoil were completely unnecessary or mattered very little, as long as you were close enough to the general target with your weapon, and your relatively large cone of spread, essentially your cone of effectiveness, had just happened to be close enough to the target you were set on. This is why majority of the competitive scene and the dedicated players dedicated to the series, kind of skipped out on Battlefield 1, which isn't to say there weren't any skilled players that played Battlefield 1, it's just that most who were kind of supposed to be carrying over to Battlefield 1 simply didn't, because the game basically made most of the guns feel like they belonged to a Splatoon. Battlefield 5, on the other hand, has actually completely done away with spread. And they also did a massive rework of suppression, yet another mechanic that used to absolutely punish skill. For balancing and designing weapons in Battlefield 5, DICE now utilizes pretty strong and harsh, yet still somewhat random, but far more predictable and ultimately trainable recoil, bullet velocity, bullet drop, rate of fire, and of course damage as the primary determinants. DICE reworked suppression instead to be a purely visual effect for the suppressed target, while still giving it some usefulness though by causing 3D spotting on the suppressed target, which is definitely useful since the 3D spotting in general in this game is far less present. And as a result of all these changes, the skill ceiling is most definitely higher for the gunplay in Battlefield, and there's actually genuine satisfaction to be had from learning and truly mastering the weapon's effectiveness beyond just like piling up points for some stupid mastery quest. And I still feel like I barely scratched the surface of a lot of these weapons, and learning them is something I'm very much looking forward to do. It's really thanks to DICE's rethinking of these weapon mechanics and how they are in Battlefield 5 that actually gives Battlefield 5 hope. Even still, despite many of its problems. No longer do the weapon mechanics feel like something that's inherently flawed or limited, that's beyond repair, besides waiting for the next game, like it has been for a while now for the series. The weapon mechanics in Battlefield 5 are actually great, stand up pretty well against even other games, and they definitely instill a sense of hope that the game just might fulfill all of its potential, even just yet, quite just yet, whatever. And that kind of brings us over to vehicles, and I really wish I could say the same as I said for infantry for the vehicles, but unfortunately the opposite kind of seems to be the case here. For one, Battlefield 5 continues the meta from Battlefield 1 of leaving planes in a largely unexciting place, with planes like bombers having a relatively low skill floor for having massive amount of influence on the ground below, especially on particularly problematic maps like Twisted Metal and Hamada, while the most direct counter to such planes, the dogfighting planes and the lighter class planes, are basically stumped with a noticeably low skill ceiling, making contention for air control something of a crapshoot. When both the skill floor and ceiling are kind of lowered like this, the ground's response also kind of becomes a bit too basic and painfully binary, with AA weapons on the ground fluctuating between overpowered or largely useless, ultimately swinging planes in and out of being too overpowered or just being atmospheric presences. There's something to be said for having a low skill floor, as it does kind of increase people's likelihood of wanting to try new things. And of course, planes are a big part of what makes Battlefield great, the combined arms aspect of it. And ultimately bringing more players to certain elements of the game, especially flying, which has, traditionally intimidated people in the past, because the better pilots would completely crap on them. But I think at the end of it still costs the game to also bring the skill ceiling so low, and ultimately kind of chopping off dedicated and skilled pilots off at the knees. It was something to behold, watching a competitive pilot who spent hundreds or sometimes even thousands of hours of practice to get so close to that high maximum skill ceiling that they were unstoppable in both competitive and public servers unless they met their counterpart. And the plane meta was definitely one of many weak points of Battlefield 1 for kind of robbing the game yet again for any kind of room for mastering skill. And that's something that seems to have carried over to Battlefield 5. Which isn't to say they're in the nearly as bad of a place as Battlefield 1 was. I still think it's quite salvageable, at least if I listen to some of the more experienced and skilled pilots. But, if anything, if you ever wanted to take it to the air without getting mind-bogglingly destroyed, now's a better time to try than ever. And I also want to thank Silk and Smiles for providing the footages. I would also kind of echo Silk's opinion that currently, Germans are getting the best bombers and the farming fighters, whereas the Brits kind of get the Spitfire and the VB, which are good against air and tanks respectively, but neither are versatile and kind of apparently boring to fly. And Germans kind of seem to have too strong of a air currently. And DICE has traditionally always had asymmetrical balance to an extent, but it seems like they kind of went slightly overboard for this particular game. And it's, I guess, something that we'd like to see addressed probably. And of course, there are the tanks. I'm going to try not to get too into the details, as tanks in Battlefield 5 is a subject I think that definitely warrants bringing in dedicated players to delve into further detail in a different video if I can manage to do that. But essentially just looking at their current state, both as a longtime infantry player as well as someone who played competitively as an in-game leader in the conquest scene, I have to say the tanks are currently in a very problematic place. First, the tanks seem to have very low mobility. Of course, the light tanks do have very high mobility, but they're in large part simply too fragile to even consider for the conversation, I think. The heavier and medium class tanks are currently simply too lacking due to their very low mobility. Actually, medium tanks likely could be far more effective with just a little bit more mobility, particularly in the acceleration department and probably just a little bit more in the maximum speed department. And of course, the heavy tanks seem nearly immobile. but the problem is they're simply too slow to cope with the infantry, and this isn't helped by the fact that DICE completely revamped the way the main turrets currently work by essentially borrowing the turret mechanics from War Thunder, which is a completely different game. I mean, it's a neat concept, but it completely fails in execution due to the key difference between Battlefield 5 and War Thunder, which is infantry after infantry after infantry. The turret mechanics combined with the mobility issues essentially just keeps tanks from being a significant part of Battlefield, no matter how big the maps are. I think with the exception of Aerodome, and even then, tanks are no longer able to partake significantly in in pushing towards objectives. And when I see tanks now, I no longer fear them. I either run circles around them, completely ignore them, or just chase after them because they're essentially free kills and points. And I think at the end of the day, Battlefield is tanks are a huge part of what makes Battlefield Battlefield, which is ultimately all about its combined arms, well, among other things. But if I were to distill it down, it's essentially that. And just to see the tanks be so gimped as they are right now has been really disappointing, and it's something I really hope DICE addresses, because this is probably one of the biggest flaws in the game right now. And the tanks aren't helped by the fact that the appearance of the infantry are more or less homogenized within factions. I'd imagine this was a decision that was made around EA and DICE wanting to drive customizations as a big part of Battlefield 5, and also probably because a lot of their post-release content is dependent on sales of such cosmetic items. And I know this because until Battlefield 5, DICE has had an excellent track record of making each class highly unique and distinct. In previous games, I've been able to tell exactly what class I was looking at without any additional information, even by just seeing the silhouette of an enemy soldier way out in the distance. That is no longer the case. While as an infantry player, I've got plenty of other cues to tell who is what, like the kill feed or the sound of the gun if I happen to hear them use it, or the occasional spotting. But for tankers, a lot of that information is not always handy, and they're definitely completely left blind as to who is who until they're fired upon. Gone are the days when they could prioritize who is what class in the thick of combat, particularly ones that could be tossing C4 or shoot rockets at them, and prioritize killing them in the chaos, because now everyone shares the same pool of clothing options, and that is also not helping their cause any other. And honestly, I think that's probably the only problem I have with the new customization options. The sounds of Screaming Woman, I almost instantly got used to. I don't care much for it, one way or the other. But the clothing options, it's neat enough, and I have zero problems with EA trying to monetize their post-release content through that. But this particular, the way they kind of did it, and I assume it's to save resources, does seem to impact the game in a pretty negative way, and in a pretty significant way for players who are dedicated tankers. And now the maps. They're significantly better in Battlefield 5 than most of the recent games in the series. It seems like DICE has decided to ditch sweating over novel gimmicks like Levolution or Behemoths that honestly didn't do much to serve the actual gameplay much at all. If anything, were mostly detrimental to the core of what makes Battlefield tick, which is combined arms and playing for objectives. It seems like instead of worrying about trying to impress reviewers or first month players with gorgeous screenshots or these gimmicks I just mentioned, DICE seems to have decided to focus on ensuring that the maps would have solid flow between the flags, and overall seems to have prioritized gameplay considerations the most. And I think this is a really important thing for longevity of the game. And of course there are 2 to maybe 3 bad maps. To me, Twisted Metal stands out most as being the most problematic one, in that it kind of plays poorly in just about every mode. But even maps that I, along with many dedicated or competitive players, seem to find to be the worst, most commonly Aerodome, Twisted Metal, and Armada, these maps do have some redeemable merits, and none of these maps actually make me want to quit out of the server or even the game, like half the maps in Battlefield 1 used to, for instance, Foul Fortress in particular. Now, I do have to note that as these maps become larger and more carved in various ways over the surface to kind of accommodate gameplay considerations and paths between flags, we're also beginning to deal with a whole lot more variations in elevation in the terrain. And I've kind of noted that vaulting detection has been a little bit too inconsistent, causing you to vault in moments you really shouldn't, or simply not triggering a vault when it really should. I could traverse the same exact spot that I traverse in one way and not be able to do the same in the exact next moment. And inconsistency, I think, is a big issue in this aspect. And I imagine it's not an easy task, but I do hope it's something that DICE works out relatively quickly over time. And fortifications, they're pretty well done. The fortifications feel more like Minecraft than Fortnite when you're building, and their implementation in Battlefield 5 has been almost seamless. While I admit the only things I ever build personally are ammo and health stations, when enemy or friendly players do build them, I find they add little variations and changes to the map that really do help the maps from quickly becoming predictable or stale. Having played all of single player and ultra settings, I would definitely say the game looks absolutely gorgeous. I would imagine anyone playing Battlefield for that immersive experience will probably get a kick out of playing Battlefield 5, provided that they have a pretty decent PC. The sound design is as great as it's ever been, something that's always been incredibly consistent for the Battlefield franchise since Bad Company, and the graphics in this game really do take things up to a whole another notch. Now, for the record, all of my footages, all of them in multiplayer, by the way, are set to be set to the lowest settings possible, pushed even further with config files that almost make the game appear broken at times, but it does give me maximum frames on my potato rig and, of course, maximum visibility. And even then, I do have to say that the sheer amount of texture details still present, as well as the density of just debris and various objects filling out the screen, kind of seem to keep me from being able to see enemies properly. In Battlefield 3, 4, and 1, I used to be able to turn a corner or clear a hill and instantly spot out the enemy players like they were dots on a blank sheet of paper. That's just not the case anymore. And to DICE's credit, Battlefield 1 was absolutely out of control. That was just pure artistic and atmospheric direction over any kind of gameplay consideration. And DICE definitely has become better about that. But now it just seems to be a matter of just sheer fidelity starting to get in the way of gameplay. And maybe it's just me getting old, but I do have to know that I'm not the only one who's made this point in the various circles I partake in. Anyways, all in all, Battlefield 5 it's definitely an imperfect but a very solid experience. I've not really noticed nearly as many bugs as everyone's been talking about. During my 75 or so hours of playtime in the last like a month or so, I've only ever run into one or two bugs that require me to quit out of a server. I guess I've had like maybe 2 to 3 crashes, but my stuff is overclocked way beyond it should be, so it could be on my end as well. I do think Origin could be a little bit smoother. It'd be nice to be able to join a friend without having to alt-tab and do workarounds or what have you, but all in all, like, I can't say too much about this game's instability. I did note that other people have been having more issues, and that's certainly something to consider, but at least in my personal experience, Battlefield 5 is leagues ahead of anything what Battlefield 4 was like, and it's all pretty darn close to Battlefield 1's launch, which has more or less kind of become the benchmark for the series in terms of having a stable and mostly bug-free launch. The fact that Tides of War will be free does leave this game with a lot of promise. It does remain to be seen whether or not Tides of War will continue to be an ongoing concern with all of this negativity surrounding the game. And no thanks to one of the worst marketing efforts I've ever seen for a game. And of course, the fact that Tides of War is largely contingent on continued sales of the base game, as well as the goodwills from the players extending over to purchase of cosmetic items. But even if that kind of starts to fall through, what's already been scheduled and promised for the next 7 months is going to be pretty interesting to see. Besides the map packs and the weapons or whatever, the new co-op mode versus AI kind of seems like something DICE has not really tackled before for the franchise, and it'll be interesting to see what that's like. And of course, there's definitely a lot that remains to be seen for how DICE's take on Battle Royale will be received and performed. And it's while it's a genre I'm not personally a huge fan of, if it's executed well, it will certainly bring a lot more players to the franchise, and that can, at the end of the day, honestly only be a good thing. Now, I would love to end this video on that happy, or at least optimistic conclusion, but I do have to say something about DICE and EA's absolute disregard for not bringing or even bothering to talk much at all about the current lack of RSP in Battlefield 5. RSP is a retail server program, and they're basically servers paid for and run by players. There are various communities, most of whom are some of the most dedicated to the franchise, that are absolutely contingent on the availability of RSP for various reasons. But most important of them all, to me, at least to me, is the competitive scene. Competitive is literally deprived of any oxygen of existing without the capacity to pay for and have passworded servers. I've already done 2 videos on this subject, once during Battlefield 1 and another during Battlefield 5's beta, when DICE more or less said RSP won't be available at launch. Back when I made the video about this in Battlefield 1, most people in the competitive scene told me it was pointless and that no one cared about competitive in Battlefield 1, which kind of turned out to be true when we see how Incursions turned out. When I made the video during the beta, a lot of people thought DICE would do right by the scene somehow, and that DICE wouldn't really screw everyone over. Right now, we have virtually little to no word on RSP nor competitive, besides the occasional teases and hype. But honestly, if there was something to hype up, they would be announcing stuff already, and they'd be talking about it. And a lot of the players that were once hyped up for competitive in Battlefield 5, especially given how much the gunplay and the skill cap was raised for it, are slowly beginning to grow pretty fatigued. The thing is, most competitive players, especially the best ones, are not the kind of players who get their kicks indefinitely from boosting their KD by farming players who just started playing the game in public servers. The best players want to hone their craft against others of or above their caliber. The scene is not going to sit around forever, and no matter how great the gunplay is, you're potentially risking yet another case of incursions. Just for the record, in Battlefield 1, passworded servers were not an option until 7 months after the base game had come out. And then they put out incursions a year or so later, expecting the competitive to take off of it. And it's entirely possible that I worry that DICE is going to kind of try and do the same. Or even if Squad Conquest does come out somewhat on time and it happens to be for the competitive scene, given how little feedback loop there is between the competitive scene and DICE right now, it's entirely possible that the mode would be completely out of touch with what the competitive scene needs. Squad Conquest would be for the 8s and the 10 scene. I'm not seeing much dialogue there. And that's one of many reasons why Incursions failed, because DICE and EA weren't really interested in investing the time to create the feedback loop with the competitive players and building a functioning mode that wasn't just something a small group of people who don't actually play or didn't really play competitively thought was a cool idea. We don't need more cool ideas. We need good feedback loops and we actually need sincerity in bringing competitive to the series. It's another thing I worry about is that it's entirely possible that DICE is hedging its bets on Firestorm, the upcoming Battle Royale mode, to bring a viable competitive mode to the Battlefield series, and I think this would be a terrible mistake. The existing small conquest, or even the 5 scene, is far more relatable to the public Battlefield player base than Battle Royale should and would ever be. And I think it's prudent that Battlefield's competitive scene is built around what the series has always been about. And I would actually, EA needs to stop being a follower of the market trends. I would actually blame a lot of its current marketing woes for being just that, a follower of the market, instead of the one defining the market. Let Battlefield for once try to flourish for what it is. It is still a unique entity, at least on the among the AAA titles, and I think it has the chance to thrive here if you let it. And don't get me wrong here, Firestorm is something I'm quite looking forward to seeing, or at the very least, something I hope that will do well for the series. But to me, that's not remotely close to the core gameplay of Battlefield, or what the series has been about for quite some time now. In the interest of not adding another 10 minutes to this already very long video, I'm going to delay any more of this conversation to a future video. But DICE and EA does need to do something about the lack of RSP. There are a lot of people affected by this, not just the competitive community. November was kind of a terrible month for me personally, arguably one of the worst in my life, and I'm still dealing with a lot of the aftermath. But after I managed to squeeze out this video, I'm finding that there's a lot to talk about yet, not just from me directly, but there are a lot of people I do want to reach out to. If this video appealed to you at all, I do hope you'll subscribe and check in on this channel every now and then. And until then, I guess thank you for watching.